Police say Escobar was killed near a shopping mall in Medellin, Colombia. He was shot to death by members of an elite police squad that had been searching for him since he escaped from this prison outside.
What if the most powerful drug lord in history had only one phone call that would seal his destiny? On the morning of December 2, 1993, the world's most wanted man, Pablo Escobar, sits in a concrete bunker, a fortress built for his own safety. And for exactly 5 minutes and 47 seconds, he talks to his son. That single conversation, 5 minutes of a father's love, carries a price he never imagined: the death of an empire that once generated $400 million a week, a dynasty forged in blood and wealth. Behind the closed door, a network of machines listens, calculates, triangulates. The world's most advanced surveillance teams are tracking every word, every tone. Escobar's final act of trust is also his final act of betrayal. In the next 24 hours, the man who could outspend a nation will see his empire crumble, and the blood of 4,000 souls will be counted in a single day. Join us as we uncover the truth behind those 5 minutes and 47 seconds, the last hours of a king who ruled the streets of Medellin, and how one conversation ended the reign of Pablo Escobar. December 2, 1993. The sun crests the rooftops of Los Olivos, a quiet middle-class neighborhood in Medellin. For the world, it is an ordinary dawn. For Pablo Escobar, it is the first light of the last day of his life. Inside a modest 2-story house that once seemed an unlikely refuge, a man whose name had become synonymous with power and blood walks to the window and looks out over streets that have since turned into a battlefield. He is 44, his eyes still bright with a kind of stubborn brilliance that made men across Colombia tremble and admire him in equal measure. In the weeks before, his empire had crumbled into dust. His sprawling Lastral estate, a private fortress that housed a jacuzzi, a football field, a disco, and the bones of an entire police battalion, had been emptied of its treasures. He had been forced to abandon the lavish palace that once echoed with his laughter and had taken refuge in the most unlikely of places: a cramped attic, a storage room, a basement. The man who once owned 7 planes and counted money with industrial scales now carried his life in a duffel bag and slept under the floorboards of a rented house. The world was watching him from the shadows of his own death. Across the city, a network of machines listened. Every call, every whispered conversation was captured by equipment that had never existed officially. For the first time, the government had the power to triangulate his location with a single phone call, a secret weapon that could bring down a man who had evaded capture for months. In a moment that would become the fulcrum of his final narrative, Escobar picks up his phone. The call will last 5 minutes and 47 seconds, a precise interval that will ultimately seal his fate. He has chosen this time because the city, for the first time in months, has been quiet. He can hear the muffled sound of a distant police car passing through the streets of Los Olivos. He knows the world is listening. He knows that every word will be transmitted, stored, analyzed. He is willing to pay the ultimate price for one last act of humanity. "Hello, mi hijo," he whispers into the receiver, his voice low and rough, as if it could not bear the weight of his thoughts. The call is not a simple conversation. It is a final confession, a farewell to the man he has become. He knows his son will never forgive him for the blood he has spilled, but he also knows he can do nothing but talk. He thinks of the faces of his children, the eyes that have watched him grow from a boy who ran through the streets of Santa Marta to the infamous king of cocaine. The memory of the day he first held them, a small Juan Pablo and a tiny Manuela, sits heavy on his chest. He presses the phone against his ear, his fingers trembling. "I have lived a life of contradictions," he says. "Power and poverty, love and violence. "My son, I am sorry. I am sorry for the fear that has taken root in your heart. I am sorry for the suffering that my name has brought to your mother and me." His voice cracks with a mix of regret and relief. He cannot deny the truth that his actions have inflicted wounds far deeper than any bullet. He is a man who has paid for his sins with the lives of thousands. The conversation that unfolds, the words he utters, are not just an exchange of love. They are a final testament, an acknowledgement of the empire he has built on the blood of 4,000 souls, and the promise that he will never return to that path. The conversation drifts toward the present. He speaks of the constant presence of his enemies, the sense of being chased by invisible hands. He confides that every safe house feels more like a prison now. He speaks of his wife's tears, of his children hiding in hotels that change location every few days, of the police tightening their net around their family. His life is now a balance between self-preservation and protecting those he loves. "Listen," he says, his voice softening. "I do not have the strength to keep you in this darkness. It is time to give the world a chance to move on. I will do what I must, even if it means my own death. I will give you peace." The line crackles. The final minutes feel like a slow motion of a man living in a dream that he will never wake from. His breathing slows. His heartbeat is a steady rhythm that echoes through the small living room. He thinks of the people who were killed, of the police families that became targets of car bombs, of the streets that turned into a battlefield. He thinks of the men who were once his allies and are now his enemies, the men who had to shoot their way through his own estate and leave him a mere husk. The final words he utters are not a plea for mercy. They are a declaration that he is surrendering to the only thing that could bring him peace: his own death. "Goodbye," he says softly. "I am ready." The phone hangs up. The line goes silent. In the distance, the rumble of distant thunder echoes across Medellin, a storm that seems to match the turbulence in the heart of a man who has spent a lifetime turning fire into a kingdom. The world watches, the machines recording every word, the police tightening their net. The next hour will decide the fate of a man who has held the country in his hands for so long. His last call, a testament to a life full of choices, will become the final chapter of the story that began on December 2nd, 1993. The day a man once considered a king made the ultimate sacrifice for a single act of love, a single conversation that would bring down an empire built on the blood of thousands. The city that once echoed with his laughter and terror would soon echo with the sound of silence, and the world would finally breathe a sigh that had been withheld for too long. His voice trembled as he pressed the button, the familiar thud of a telephone echoing in the cramped room where he had spent the last 2 days. The line, that thin thread that had kept him from the world, now seemed to carry something more precious than the usual taunts of foes. He had not spoken to anyone in over a year. In that silence, a seed of hope had begun to sprout, an idea that if his family could escape, perhaps he could finally surrender his crown to them and find a sliver of peace. The morning had dawned gray and cold, a stark contrast to the fire he had once commanded. He stared at the newspaper spread before him, the headline flashing a name he could scarcely imagine: "Escobar family may secure asylum in Germany." A glimmer of light flickered in the depths of his weary soul. He had lived by a single rule: never let his phone talk longer than 3 minutes, never call from the same spot twice, never break protocol. Those rules had kept the law from catching him. Yet, as the paper's words slipped across his mind, a compulsion grew that could not be silenced. At 10:23 a.m., his fingers trembled as he dialed a number he had memorized but rarely used. The call connected. not to a fortified compound or a shadowed office, but to a hotel room in Bogotá where his son, Juan Pablo, and his wife hid, eyes wide with fear, yet buoyed by the warmth of a father's voice. In that moment, Pablo, the man who had once commanded billions in property, had slipped into the role of a weary father. He told his son about escape plans, whispered about Mexico, promised new beginnings. He said, "I love you, son. Soon we will be together again." The conversation swelled beyond his usual 3 minutes. As the seconds stretched into a 5-minute and 47-second-long dialogue, laughter bubbled from his daughter, Manuela, on television, a sound that had been absent from his life for too long. The father in him felt alive, the king in him almost forgotten. He hung up with a sudden surge of hope that, for the first time in months, his heart beat in rhythm with something other than survival. Unaware, across the city, search operators had already begun to triangulate his location. In a concrete bunker, machines worked like sentinels, listening for the faintest crack in his digital veil. The same day he spoke to his son, a silent storm brewed over Medellin. The operation had been meticulously planned. Search block units had trained for this exact moment for a year, each of them having lost friends to his merciless bombs. When the order came to surround the area, the units moved like ghosts through narrow streets, their boots soft against cobblestones, their eyes scanning for the slightest sign of movement. Snipers settled on rooftops, rifles poised, while assault teams crept from both ends of the block, forming a net that tightened with every passing second. The police had already marked the block in their maps. 2 possible streets, 3 possible houses. The city's law enforcement had narrowed his location to within 100 meters, a range that made capture feasible but escape impossible. Every street corner was watched, every window covered. The operation was swift, precise, and inevitable. For months, his family had lived under the shadow of a man who had once held the country in his hands. Now, that same man was about to be brought back into the ordinary world of traffic, coffee, and the hum of a distant soccer ball. As the sun climbed, a tense silence fell over the neighborhood. Mothers hung laundry, children chased a worn soccer ball down dusty streets, unaware of the looming confrontation that would soon erupt. In the midst of that ordinary life, the most famous shootout in Colombian history would unfold, a climax that had been rehearsed by men whose names were etched into the annals of the nation's history. At 1:47 p.m., the first search block units arrived. Their presence was quiet, almost imperceptible. They positioned themselves, checking their gear, ensuring their rifles were loaded. The city's heart beat steadily, the pulse of a town that had never known such intensity. By 2:04 p.m., the final order had been issued. The net closed around the block. For a moment, the world held its breath. The air thickened with tension as the police approached the house where Pablo had been sheltering. The doors creaked under the weight of expectation. Inside, he sat with his head bowed, a shadow of the man who had once commanded men with a mere glance. He had broken his own rule, the same rule that had kept him alive for so long. Now, in the silence before the storm, his heart pounded against his ribs like a drum. He thought of his wife's tearful eyes, the laughter of his children, the streets that had turned into battlefields. He thought of the countless lives he had claimed, the families shattered by his ambition. The weight of it all pressed upon him, a burden he could no longer bear. A sudden shout cut through the air. A police officer, visor pulled down, raised a weapon. The first shot rang out. The house shook, the walls echoing the sound of bullets ricocheting against metal and plaster. The air tasted of gunpowder and fear. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to tilt. Then it steadied, the sounds of gunfire filling the alleyways. The shootout erupted, a crescendo of violence that seemed to swallow the quiet neighborhood whole. Inside the house, Pablo's breath was shallow, his body trembling. He stared at the ceiling, a flicker of regret in his eyes. He had known this day would come, yet he could not help but feel the gravity of his impending fate. The echo of his last call lingered, his promise to his son, the promise of a future that now seemed as distant as the German asylum he had heard about. Outside, the police advanced, rifles at the ready. The city's pulse quickened as the final moments of the operation unfolded. For a brief, fleeting instant, it felt as though the world could hold its breath until the last word he would speak. The shootout intensified, the gunfire staccato against the backdrop of a city that had known so much bloodshed. He could feel the heat of the gunfire against his chest, the shuddering of the floorboards under his weight, the sting of adrenaline rushing through his veins. The minutes that followed were frantic, each second a test of will and resolve. Inside, the walls of the house creaked, the echoes of bullets a relentless reminder of the end that approached. The police pressed forward, their presence overwhelming. The last call, the promise of peace, seemed now as a memory in a world that was turning irreversibly towards darkness. In the heart of Medellin, where streets had once echoed with his laughter and terror, a silence would soon descend. The city, weary of his reign, would finally breathe a sigh that had been withheld for too long. The last 24 hours of Pablo Escobar were not simply a series of violent confrontations, but a final act of surrender, a confession whispered into the quiet before the inevitable. The story that began with the roar of gunfire and the sound of a father's voice would close in a single, devastating moment, leaving behind a city that could now move forward, free from the weight of one man's empire. The sun had slipped behind the jagged rooftops of Los Olivos, painting the sky in bruised amber as the city held its breath. Pablo's gaze, once a calm, calculating eye, now flitted across the windows, searching for a single opening, a sliver of air that could still carry him out of this final battlefield. The sound that pierced the stillness, a distant, rhythmic crack of a warning shot, sent a shiver up his spine, and the world narrowed to the single, unblinking glare of a bullet. His hand, weathered by years of steel and blood, found the 9mm Sig Sauer that had been his companion in every conquest. The weight of the pistol was a familiar comfort, a reminder that, even in death, he could still strike. The firefight erupted with a ferocity that seemed almost cinematic. Over 6 minutes, the streets of Medellin became a gallery of shattered glass and sprayed metal. More than 200 rounds slammed into the walls, each impact a percussion against the heart of the city. The tactical squad in Los Olivos, a unit forged in the crucible of the Colombian military, delivered a disciplined hail of fire. AR-15 Gall rifles, machine guns that sang at a steady 600 rounds per minute. The bullets tore through the thin walls of the house, turning them into paper that fluttered against the concrete below. Windows exploded in jagged shards, sending bright flashes across the alley, while cars, once symbols of status, lay broken, their steel skeletons twisted in the crossfire. The roar was deafening, a relentless roar that could be felt in the marrow of every bone. Pablo understood that this was a battle he could not win. The odds were not only in favor of the search block, but in favor of a well-positioned, heavily armed force. He had faced countless enemies before, but the scale of this was unprecedented. He could not simply retreat into the maze of rooftops. There was no safe path. The only way left was to confront the final truth of his own story, the choice between the endless cycle of violence and a final act of defiance that would close his chapter forever. He grabbed Lemon's hand, feeling the tremor in the other man's fingers, and together they sprinted toward the roof, a place they had known, a place that had been their escape route for years. Each step was a prayer, each stride a plea for freedom. Yet, bullets followed them as if they were ghosts, spiraling down across the clay tiles. Lemon was struck first, a single round to the chest, and he collapsed, the world collapsing in a spray of blood. Pablo did not look back. The pain in his own body, his leg, his back, pulsed with every heartbeat, but his mind was a razor-sharp focus on the only path left. He pressed forward, breath ragged, as he felt the world tilt toward a new horizon. On that rooftop, the concrete and the wind became his only companions. The city lay below him in a chaotic tapestry of fire and motion, while the sky above was a silent witness. He was 51 years old, a man once known for his weight, his strength, his power, now a figure reduced to a man with a rifle, a man with a decision. The roar of gunfire had faded into a distant echo, replaced by the harsh wind that pressed against his face, a wind that felt like a sigh from the city itself. He stared at the rooftops, the same rooftops that had carried him across Medellin in 1,000 different escapes. He saw the thin line between his past and the ending of his story. A sudden thought pierced his mind. His son, the one voice he had never heard in the last days. He reached into the memory of a call that had last stretched for 5 minutes and 47 seconds, the phone call that had become his final act of love. His son's voice, soft and familiar, filled his head. He thought of his son's laughter, the way his eyes had shone with innocence when they spoke. He thought of the small kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the quiet of the night. He remembered the promise he had made, the promise that he would call if anything ever happened. That promise became his anchor. In a world where his power had been measured in money, men, and fear, the smallest, most fragile human connection became the most powerful weapon he could wield. The gun he had carried, his 9mm Sig Sauer, stood in his palm, cold and unyielding. The official narrative would later claim a search block officer had fired the fatal shot, a bullet that would close the story of the king of cocaine. But the unofficial version, the one that the people of Medellin whispered in hushed tones, was that Pablo, with a final breath of courage, turned the gun upon himself, not to escape, but to end a life that had become a storm that could not be stopped. At 3:15 p.m. on the 2nd of December, 1993, the rooftop of Los Olivos became the setting for the death of a man who had reshaped a nation. In the immediate aftermath, the streets of Medellin erupted in a cacophony of emotion. Some people rushed out, their faces bright with tears of triumph. Others mourned silently. The city had been suffocated by the violence of the past years, and the death of the cartel king seemed to release a breath that had been held for decades. The news spread like wildfire. People around the world stared at the headlines, fascinated by the end of the man who had built an empire on drugs and blood. In Medellin, the silence that followed was heavy, a silence that felt like a promise that the city could breathe once more. Yet the story did not end with a quiet silence. The void left by Pablo was an invitation to other forces. The drug war did not pause. New cartels rushed forward, eager to claim the territory that had once been under his dominion. The flow of cocaine continued, the veins of the underworld pulsing through the streets. The violence continued. The war did not end with his death. His legacy was not only the empire he built, but the war that outlasted him. A war that now seemed less a man's failure and more a collective failure of the system. In the final hours before his death, the man who had once commanded with a glance had become a human, a father, a monster, and a hero all at once. The narrative of the last 24 hours is a mirror of his own life, a story of power, of fear, of love, of loss. The last phone call that killed him was a testament to the choice between survival and love, between the endless cycle of violence and the brief, fragile moment of human connection. In the end, Perhaps that was his most enduring legacy. Not the empire he built, but the story he chose to end. A story that continues to haunt the city he once ruled. In the silence that followed the gunshot, the city's heartbeat seemed to pause. The street vendors, who had been busy for hours, lowered their canopies as if in reverence. Children who had scurried through the streets with stolen chocolate stopped mid-crash, their tiny hands trembling. The rain that had begun to fall the previous night swelled into a steady mist, washing the faces of the citizens as though cleansing them of a decades-long stain. For a fleeting moment, Medellin held its breath, as if waiting for the universe to decide whether to let this man's story finally end. Even as the police vans rolled to the rooftop of Los Olivos, the city's pulse remained fragile. The sound of distant sirens wove through the air, each echoing a memory of a time when life itself was a negotiation between fear and power. But this time, the siren's wail carried a different tone, a mournful, almost hopeful one, as if the city itself was mourning the loss of a tyrant while simultaneously tasting a faint promise of renewal. He had spent his life walking on the razor's edge between dominion and desolation. Those same edges now felt less like a line and more like a threshold. The last phone call he made was a desperate plea to himself, a final argument between the man who had known the taste of invincibility and the man who had grown weary of living with the weight of a nation's hopes and hatred upon his shoulders. The voice that answered was his own, faint and hollow, reverberating through the cold steel of his hand. He said nothing beyond a single word: "I'm done." His fingers trembled as he reached for the trigger. In that breath, the weight of all his choices collapsed into a single undeniable truth: that even the King of the Shadows could no longer defy the inevitability of his own demise.